Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Yongping Zhai, Chief of Energy Sector Group. I'm very happy to be with our speakers here today in this session on ADB Energy Policy Consultation. A little bit background before we proceed with speakers. The background is that ADB has its energy policy dated 2009. It's 11 years old, and since then there's tremendous changes, as you know, in terms of the energy sector landscape. A lot of new technologies emerged, and the cost of renewable energy have come down dramatically. And also during these last 10 years or 11 years, and there have been global commitment, as we know, as Paris Agreement and also Sustainable Development Goals. And to align with our policy with this development and the global commitment, we are going to actually this year, we are revising and updating our energy policy. To do so, we would like to have a series of consultations with all stakeholders. For the last 6 months, I've been doing consultations with over 16 sessions, over 200 people, different countries, different experts, industry players, academics, professors, all kind of different stakeholders. I requested, actually for this forum in Southeast Asia, I requested a session on energy policy consultation. I think that this is very relevant for the region and very relevant for me also, important for me to get views from our distinguished panelists today. And the key questions for us to understand is if Asia wants to move away from coal, for example, and this is one of the key issues here, and what are the technologies we can rely on, the countries could rely on. And energy, as should be there to support different other sectors. So how energy would work and support other sectors like transport, education, health sector, for example. Now the pandemic is still ongoing, and how the energy sector can help to ensure the cold chain for transportation of vaccines, for example. And talking about vaccines and how energy sector should react and respond to the pandemic, and that's going to be stay for a long while. I think I've been myself working from home for exactly 1 year as of today. So how energy sector will be able to respond to these challenges. So these are some of the questions we would like to reflect during the process of energy policy updating. So without further ado, I would like to actually go to our panelists to hear from their views, and also would like to hear from them what would be the requirement from their perspective on ADB, what ADB should do, and how ADB can do better. So with that a short introduction, I would like to invite our first speaker in my list, Dr. Nuki Agya-Utama, Executive Director, ASEAN Center for Energy. Dr. Nuki, please.
Thank you very much, Yongping Zhai, for this very great opportunity, inviting us to this session. Indeed, it is very, very interesting question that you just raised on how the region are facing the new era on decarbonization, or the way that we pursue on the reducing our reliance on the fossil fuel. Indeed, it is a very tough question. As you may know that our region has launched our ASEAN Energy Outlook 6 last year during ASEAN Energy Minister meetings in Vietnam, November 2020. Over there, we also predict in the next 20 years, up to 2040, the region still rely heavily on the fossil fuel, both in the power sectors as well as the transportation sector. On the power sector itself, the predicted demand will be increased more than twofold. including the in the industrial sectors as well as residential sector, which is the highest is the industrial sectors. I think it's very, very interesting to see what is going to be in the futures and what measures that we need to take. First of all, in regard with the new technologies or the innovation that we need to achieve decarbonization, we discussed a lot on the possibilities of the small medium reactors on the modular parts for the reducing the carbon emission in the power sectors, and also we try to increase the share of the natural gas to replace the current coal power plant. And we also talk on the CCUS perspective, not only the carbon capture but utilizing and storing for the next couple of decades. However, in the transition itself, it is very important not to avoid the current existing power plant, which is we still have plenty of newly built coal power plant, for example. So on that sense, we try to introduce the high efficient and low emission type of power plants, such as the supercritical, and also the potential on including the biomass with the co-firing technology. So that's on the power sectors. In regard with these transportation sectors, we try to increase the share of biofuel and biodiesels. Since 26% in 2040, the share of the energy coming from these transportation sectors. So of course, the whole perspective of energy, we need also to consider not only the supply side, but also the demand side, which is efficiency is one of the things that we need to do. The innovation on the battery and the technology introduction on the replacing the current silicon wafers into the perovskites, for example. And also we need to consider to improve our current grid and introducing smart grid into the region. And as you know also that we have a good, very, very big plan on the ASEAN interconnection grid, which already being implemented in the last 2 years for the connection between Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, and last year with Singapore, and maybe the coming years with Indonesia. I think the whole, this thing we cannot explain it in a few minutes, but that's the whole key takeaways updates coming from our regions. Thank you.
Sorry very much. Sorry. I would like to thank Dr. Uttama for his remarks. I said also that after hearing from other speakers, I would like to come back to Dr. Uttama on some of the specific examples. Say, let's take one country example for you to prepare. Let's take Indonesia or any other country in the region as one example. How is it possible and how fast these countries or one of these countries can move away or cannot move away depending on situation to low carbon systems. So let's take Indonesia, for example, in the second round of your remarks. So with that, I would like to move to our next speaker, Mr. Dr. Ambu Morsi, who is a senior energy economist, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. Dr. Ambu, please.
And thank you, Dr. Zai, and good morning or good evening or good afternoon to the participants and also fellow panelists. I basically appreciate Dr. Zai's initiative to bring the new energy policy for ADB, which is already 11 years old. Basically, there are 4 questions that this consultation process wants to address. So I will bring some of these our perspectives on these 4 questions. The first one is what are the emerging technologies, and the second is what are the cross-sectoral issues. Third one is the long-term impact on the COVID, and finally, what could be the needs and the priorities of the developing countries. All these questions are very complex, and there is no simple answer. given that, basically, I would like to bring a kind of a new or three imperatives for this new energy policy should look into it, and as well as the three new emerging opportunities that new policy could look into it. And also during this process, I will share some of the surveys that is be done by IRIA and what are these constraints or the barriers for this upscaling these energy investments. My first imperative for the new energy policy is that is, it should be the human focus. That is humanizing this energy access. And I think we know that is the ADB is a very crucial and support to these developing member countries to lifting millions of people out of the poverty. But this is a partly told story. And still, we can see that is the substantial part of the population still have the difficulty in accessing to these clean and energy sources. And if you look into this region, particularly Southeast Asia, still most of the countries has this electricity consumption is per capita energy consumption is very low. So this per capita energy consumption is directly related to the Human Development Index. That is the welfare, human welfare. I think here the first narrative comes for this ADB, how they are going to provide this new clean energy. And these countries, this population has all the right to catch up their counterparts in the advanced economies who are consuming more energy and having the higher development index. So first imperative is how this energy mixes will be and what could be the affordability and then accessibility and the sustainability. That need a clear look into this, what kind of energy mix the countries and the regions has. Second thing is ADB is the current policy framework is also, I think, starting from 2016, ADB is providing a lot of the technology and the financial assistance to realign that energy policies towards the long-term goals of the climate change. But here the challenge comes here is, I think most of these Paris climate agreements, as reflected in the NDCs, focusing more on the improving this energy efficiency and increasing this renewable energy share. That means it is really ADB policies look for increasing this or improving that energy intensity. But if you look into this COP25 next year, there may be changes in these NDCs. Then the new energy policy to make into that kind of reality, that is how this carbon intensity is going to be changed. And what could be the role for this ADB support for, which will be a kind of more complex. You know, there is the difference between this energy intensity and the carbon intensity. So we need a structural changes. How this new ADB policy is going to impact these structural changes is a kind of a challenge that we need to look into it. Third one is almost in this part of this region, particularly the Southeast Asia, and almost all the countries has been implementing these energy sector reforms. Basically, that is, if you see, there is the one of this is the energy efficiency. We had seen these targets. Now ASEAN has collectively improved these energy efficiency targets, and also at the national level we have these renewable energy targets. But to my sense, and these two are the kind of low-hanging fruits. Basically, the countries has already done it, but the more challenging part is how this end-use fuel switching will happen. So this is a kind of an area where ADB's new policy could look into it, which is a really hard energy sector reform is needed. That need not only for the supporting this R&D, but who is going to pay for this financial incremental cost, whether it is a multilateral institution or the national government or the common public. And we also have this transfer of the technology challenges and the new emerging technologies. So these are the three imperatives that ADB's new policies should look into it, or should at least to debate it. The
Thank
next
you.
is the opportunity, and Dr. Zai mentioned which technologies could replace the coal, and here the answer is not very clear, and there is no silver bullet, but this emerging evidences show that there are some of the technologies which has their revealed comparative advantages when compared to the coal. And they also can support some kind of new innovation or the kind of innovation network within the country and across the countries. Here we see that is a very clear picture, and see within the Green Innovation Index from 1 to 2, we found the smart grids, photovoltaics, and storage and road transport. They lies. They have more comparative advantages, but they need to be upscaled, and it has to be absorbed at the economy wide. So this have things, and also we have that next layer. We do have a kind of wind and the clean coal or nuclear, and here we need to see there is what could be the comprehensive strategy to look into it, and what could be the comparative advantages that brings this industry, these technologies can develop the new jobs. And the next question is what could be the cross-sectoral issues, and here my take here is that now ASEAN is thinking about this developing a long-term policy framework for circular economy. And if you see that circular economy is a kind of a new economic model that has been emerging out in Europe and other countries, that could be applicable, and that has a different meaning for the energy sector. If you look into the energy sector, and this circular economy could be an enhancer for cleaner energy transition, if we have a focus on waste to energy projects, or more in this Southeast Asia, more agriculture biomass are there, and so it could be a kind of a circular economy concept of bringing the distributed energy systems. And if you look into the fossil fuel, it could be a kind of a carbon recycling process, that how we can better use of this CCU, natural gas, and also small scale reactors. So circular economy is one of the key cross-sectoral issues that is emerging out that could be harnessed from the perspective of developing member countries. The second cross-sectoral issue is at the regional level is this ASEAN Smart City Network. There are already 26 cities that has been committed for the smart city, basically introduction of these ICT technologies. And here we did, basically so far this ASEAN Smart City Network is thought, or it is assumed to be a kind of investment platform. But it provides an opportunity, and there are some estimations available. If this application of these ICT technologies is introduced and upscaled at the city level, and we can find about energy consumption, energy efficiency could be improved by 4 to 7%, and then it could be also resulted in about 17% of the emission reductions, and it has multiple co-benefits. So I think these are the two areas where this new energy policy could look into it and develop a new financial mechanisms to support these developing member countries. And the third question is what could be the long-term impact of COVID? And we need to acknowledge the fact that the pandemic is far from over. And this is what happened during this 2008 crisis. And we found at this regional level, this is the kind of estimation for the ASEAN plus 10 countries. And basically, about 1% reduction in the energy use has been observed during this 2008 crisis, but it is much more. But there is, in this last year, 2020 itself, this COVID has a very transformative story to tell. And here we find that the lockdown has resulted in this reducing the energy demand. And we also find work from home models, and this could be a kind of structural change. And we are not sure basically how these business models will be resting in the future and how permanent it will be. But but the digitalization has happened, and within the 1 year we can find that this transformation has been shrinked basically within a year. And we also see that is the resilient energy. That is the, Dr. Zai mentioned about this cold storage for this vaccine. And but in the first half of 2020, we see that is how that is energy supply was resilient to supporting the health sector. So and also during the last year itself, China and Japan and Singapore has announced this net zero targets. So this transformative has some implications, and this how permanent this transformation or will be a kind of an impact that is we need to study, and we need to see that is the future opportunities, as well as there is a possibility that is we may come back to this return to this original, because with some cities and some countries this rebound effect has already been observed. Then another important thing that is we need to see is this impact financing. And IRIA has did a survey that is what are the investor perception of the demand and the readiness for this clean energy investments. Basically, we contacted about 2,000 investors, bankers, as well as the project developers. This is the perception basically they have about it. I think within the ASEAN and the +3 countries, and or you can say this ASEAN +6, most of them see that it's a demand immediately after signing into the Paris Agreement. Nearly 70%, most of the 70% of these investors, they see a demand for these low carbon investments. Some of them also see that is a coal investment is going to be a standard assets. But if you think whether you can invest on it, but here they thanks this complex story. That is the readiness to make the investment is effective if there is a de-risking mechanisms are available. And here they are very clear, and here they expect much more role from the governments and as well as these international financial institutions like ADB. And this is also, this is as a part of the study, it happened before the COVID, and we asked these investors, about 300 people, and what are the areas that is region can cooperate together, the countries and the private sector can cooperate together. And this is the findings of this perceptual survey, and as President mentioned yesterday morning, and there are 6 areas that is they find there is much more cooperation. One is that is the carbon pricing. Here, no country is wanted to go alone for the carbon pricing because it has the competitiveness. Second thing is most of the private sectors wants to have a kind of energy transition project and fund, basically regional fund. And the third one is they want more kind of a financial warranty program. So, for example, it exists in the mining sector, but they wanted to have it for these renewable energy programs or the energy efficiency programs. And also they find a kind of regional regulations on the energy financing services. And also there is an expectation for having a kind of clear taxonomy for the green bonds, because so that is how this proceeds of these green bonds can be here. Here there is a much more role for these regional institutions like ADB, where we are bringing this more harmonization of these standards on the taxonomy. This is my last concluding slide, and that shows that is the basically to address the question, what are the needs and the priorities of the developing countries? Here, I don't want to pretend to be a kind of representative of all these diversity economies, but this is a kind of sample that is we got it, and from this from the investors, what are these opportunities to mitigate this investment risk? And here, most of these investors, they think this power purchase agreement, but that is the kind of risk mitigation mechanisms. And the second factor comes is about the long-term policies, particularly this energy efficiency. And the third one is most of them, they think that is the government guarantees are needed, because nobody wants to be the first loser when there is the viability gap in investing these clean energy projects. And I think equal number of stakeholders agree that is the fossil fuel subsidies remain as a kind of a challenge. So having this kind of perceptual capture and what could be this new ADB energy policy could look into it. And here I have a kind of four agenda that ADB can look into it. One is how this energy sector policies see that is distribution systems. How this more investments could be done into these the energy systems, where still most of these utilities are the public sector undertakings, and secondly, the circular economy system. So, how we can enable more investments that needed from the institutional investors and the bond markets. I think that this new energy policy could look into it. And the third point I would like to miss is to look into this SMEs and the smart cities, particularly enhancing this energy efficiency. That need a completely different type of ESCO models. And the smart cities, as I mentioned, it provides an opportunities, this application of the digital technologies to improve the service delivery. That need a kind of a new innovative financial mechanisms, because these cities, the financial capacity of the cities are very much limited. And third one is this new policies also emphasize the sub-regional cooperation like Greater Mekong region and also CAREC programs. But here we need that is the investments getting into the cross-border investment is risky. And still considered to be a kind of risky investment from the institutional investors. Maybe like this Laos and Thailand model could be looked into it, how it could be upscaled, and also what type of tax structures could be thought about it. And these are the kind of four broader areas that ADB's new energy policies could look into it, and much more debate could be done. And so I stop here, and once again thanking the ADB for having this opportunity to share our thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ambu. Just a quick question. Did you use, were you using a PPT presentation, or you were just talking out of your, without notes?
So I'm using PowerPoint. You have not received it? You have not seen it?
No, I didn't see it. I can see reflection in your glasses. You was having some PPT, but I couldn't see on screen my side. But anyway, I thank you for covering so comprehensively all my questions. I would like to come back to you if we still have time for second round for a specific question to you. You mentioned reforms, right? In the earlier generation of market-oriented reforms, actually, with unbundling of the power systems, the regulations, and cost recovery tariffs and so on. So this kind of reform we have, went through, but given the new requirement of the climate actions to meet the target of low carbon transition, even the new carbon neutrality in the future, what kind of a new generation of market reform, if any, as an economist, what would you say? Because we need to see beyond the unbundling, beyond the independent of regulation, beyond what we knew, what would be the your advice on a new generation of market reform? So prepare yourself, and let me move to Dr. Philip Andrews Speed, who is the head of Energy Security Division, Energy Studies Institute, National University of Singapore.
Thank you, Dr. Jai. Good afternoon, everybody. Looking at the ADB document, what are ADB's guiding principles as it updates the energy policy? I'm going to address briefly three of them: the policy commitments of the relevant ASEAN member states, social safeguards, and the economic dimension under I suppose three topics. One is the pandemic, which has just been mentioned. Secondly, addressing the interests of the fossil fuel community, which was addressed in the previous panel, I wish to expand upon, and the issue of transaction costs of renewable energy. So the pandemic, here at Energy Studies Institute, we've just completed a study for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, looking at the impact of the pandemic on renewable energy in Southeast Asia, also India and China. And we saw the short-term impact was, yes, as demand fell down, then the share of renewable energy increased a bit. because there were some obligations to dispatch or lowest cost dispatch, but that increase wasn't very large, which suggests that the obligation to dispatch is not rigorously enforced. But in the context of this discussion, we looked for new energy policies in ASEAN member states that would indicate an acceleration of the low carbon transition. And our work was at the last few months of last year, we did not see any. And although countries were saying we're going to build renewable energy, they were also planning to build fossil fuel capacity as well in the power sector. So we didn't come away thinking, oh, the pandemic really is accelerating governments' desire to push ahead with the energy transition. So I'll park that there, and maybe that evidence will emerge in this coming year. The second one is addressing the interests and concerns of the fossil fuel community. And now we had an excellent presentation by Casey Ho of Prudential Insurance in the previous session on an energy transition mechanism, which was designed to basically cover the stranded costs of coal-fired power plants. And that's fine. And you can do the same, I suppose, for coal mines, oil fields, and oil refineries. But of course, in all these countries, wherever you are, these are very powerful corporations, state-owned enterprises or private sector, and related political interests. But it's not just them, it's all the actors along the supply chains to these industries and services. So you're talking about hundreds of thousands or millions of people whose jobs will disappear. Now, again, in the previous panel, Michael Renner of IRENA showed how effective renewable energy is at creating employment, or could be. But as discussed in that panel, the employment needs new skills and may not be in the same locations. So, okay, maybe offshore oil industry can move to offshore wind. Maybe the oil industry can move to hydrogen, which nobody's talked about much yet. But I think the coal industry will be much more difficult because it's very much located in a small number of places. And there's certainly a risk in some countries that whole towns or even regions will just lose their industry. And certainly in China, where I work a lot, the issue of old mining cities is a real problem. And I think that, so I think the issue of redeployment of people is much more complicated than just saying, well, let's just sort of train them all up in renewable energy. It's a different location, it's different skills, it'll probably be the younger generation. And the stranded costs only hits the big corporations. It will not hit all the people who supply the widgets and gadgets that go into those plants. So I think there's a real social challenge here if you wish to accelerate. And of course, this is not new. I mean, in Britain, where I've come from, yeah, there are whole areas of northeast England that were coal mining and shipbuilding and steel that are now would be deserted if the car manufacturing hadn't come in. So this is not a new problem globally, but it's a new problem, I think, for Southeast Asia. Now, renewable energy. Now, the economists always tell us that the levelized cost of energy, of renewable energy, is usually, maybe in some places, less than that of fossil fuels, maybe. But for me, the transaction costs in many countries are substantial per unit of potential output of electricity, especially if you're talking about not just little bits of local electricity, you're talking about wanting to build tens of gigawatts of solar or wind across a country. Because the land area, if you're doing it on land, is several times that needed for, say, a nuclear plant or a coal-fired plant. And also, most renewable energy projects are not large enough to attract the attention of central government. I mean, if central government wants a gigawatt of nuclear or coal, it can make it happen. If you're talking about dozens of 50 megawatt plants. That isn't something that the central government can come down and just push and make it happen. So you're dealing with local governments, landowners, land use rights holders, villages. So the whole transaction costs of getting these plants in place, to me, in most cases, is going to be much higher. And it's not just a matter of the levelized cost of electricity. So I've taken a deliberately broad view here. The issue of, and coming back to Anbu Modzi's talk, is the pandemic an accelerator of the low carbon energy transition, or is it going to be back as business as usual? The interests of the fossil fuel communities are much wider than just those of the core companies. It's thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who then are part of the supply chain into it, and then the transaction costs of renewable energy. So these are not solutions, I'm afraid, Dr. Jai. These are complicating factors in the push for the low carbon transition in Southeast Asia. I will stop there. Thank you.
I would like to thank Dr. Philip for giving us a fair assessment of the situation from his perspective. Yeah, I cannot see even myself. So this system is okay. Anyway, okay. Where is my? Anyway, I start talking again. So with Dr. Philip, I would like to ask a further question on the next round, if we still have time. The role of natural gas, whether you see a gas as form of transition fuel, a fair way of moving, toward the low carbon system for next round. Thank you. So next speaker, Dr. Connor Hickey, Research Associate and Lead Stranded Asset, or interesting, and Transition Finance, very interesting concept. Oxford, the Sustainable Finance Program, please.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Wonderful to be here. So I'm going to speak on a few points at the moment. What we've seen internationally, and what's great to see about the energy policy of ADB is the focus on clean energy growth. But as we know, and as important as it is to grow clean energy, it comes as a risk potentially, and it has in the past, to incumbent utilities as well. And in that process, they've lost a lot of money. And as a result of that, and speaking and drawing on from Philip's earlier points, Dr. Philip's earlier points as well, that's come at a cost to particular communities where coal plants have been shut down as well, and has kind of gone against development objectives, even in developed economies where areas have fallen back into poverty or have created large social issues. So today, I think one of the things I'd like to advocate for in the energy policy of the ADB is a recognition of the stranded asset risk that currently lies within Southeast Asia. I'm going to try and quantify that a small bit, and also the way that ADB may be able to work together with member state countries to reduce that risk for incumbent utilities, for example, as they're going to be incredibly important to deliver infrastructure at scale that's required to meet these challenges. So, great. So I'm going to give a brief overview as to what stranded assets are and the environmental related risk. A very simple approach to measure stranded assets in Southeast Asia, some analysis of that, and then what the implications could be for ADB's policy. So stranded assets are assets that have suffered from unanticipated write-downs or unanticipated or premature write-downs, devaluations, or conversions to liabilities. And there's a lot of context that this can form through. I'm going to speak briefly today on the transition side. So clean energy costs and the policy implications, but there's obviously physical risks that can cause it. Legal liability and litigation can cause those issues as well. Among social norms, we're seeing pressure for companies all around the world to reposition their service offering around clean products and products that don't harm the environment, for example, in any way. And this can have impacts for supply chains across the world as corporations work to reorganize their operations around clean energy. And also the economic perspective of stranded asset risk and the absence of policy is also understood. This is some brief analysis from Carbon Tracker, but effectively showing that we've passed a point where in large parts around the world new renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels. We're moving to a stage in some places of the world where new renewables are cheaper than operating the cost of existing fossil fuel plants. They do some initial analysis on new dispatchable renewables being cheaper than new fossils, but not really at a scale that's conducive to seasonal storage, more just batteries. But the idea is that existing infrastructure today, like coal plants and gas plants in Southeast Asia, could become stranded, not because of policy, but just because of market dynamics, and they could be uncompetitive. And we've seen this happen at such an accelerated pace in Europe and the US already, and that it could likely be something that features strongly in the next 10 years in Southeast Asia. But one thing I want to get on top of as well is, how aligned are these countries with Paris, the 1.5 and 2 degree scenarios, and what kind of risk does that lie? And how does that have implications for further renewable energy investment? Growth and the use of fossil fuels in power generation has been incredibly important for energy access requirements, and most likely will be in the future. But if it can't make money or sustain itself, it reduces the financial capacity for utilities and countries to invest in cleaner forms of growth as well. And if it's not managed properly, leads to industrial decline potentially and social issues. So in this analysis, I'm briefly just going to stack up all the power plants in the world. What are their projected future emissions over their expected lifetime, and how does that comply with carbon budgets? So these red lines in this graph here represent carbon budgets. The different colors represent the different fuel types, and they're all ranked by carbon intensity. So let's take the least carbon intensive source of energy around the world to the most carbon intensive source of power generation around the world, and see how compatible they are with each individual budget. So if we ran all these plants together, how many would fit in this budget based on a certain carbon intensity? This does not account for the important piece, which is an equitable and just transition for Southeast Asia. And there's definitely a refinement in analysis to do that, and it should be considered in any sort of analysis of this area as well. But just to briefly go through it from this analysis, according to a 1.5 degree budget from the latest IPCC budgets, about 43% of global power generation assets in fossil fuel power generation assets are incompatible with the Paris 1.5 degree budget. These are the earlier RA5 scenarios, and then those scenarios which are a little less flexible and have different assumptions, up to 93% of global fossil fuel units are not compatible with the 1.5 degree carbon budget. So what does this mean for Southeast Asia? Well, putting this analysis on top of Southeast Asian countries, it shows us that in this graph, what we're seeing is a view of what is the incompatibility of fossil fuel units by individual countries in Southeast Asia. And what we can see here is that up to between 40 and 50% are likely to be incompatible with the 2 degree carbon budget in Vietnam and Thailand. And Indonesia also presents as a significant risk as well, in the fact that up to between 20 and 30% of fossil fuel units in that power generation in Indonesia are not compatible with those budgets either. And if we take this analysis and just bring it across to maybe 3 major utilities that operate in those countries, what we find is with a 1.5 degree budget for Thailand's electric utility agency, the Electricity Generating Authority of Thailand, EGAT, for a 1.5 degree budget, up to 98% of their fossil fuel units may not be compatible with those budgets. Again, this doesn't account for equitability, and that's a huge concern in its own right. But if we, the most carbon intense assets are likely to be coal ones, and they feature further out on that carbon locking curve I presented earlier. And with major utility in Indonesia, it's in the high 80s, and also in Vietnam for the major utility there, again in the mid 90s as well. So a significant amount of misalignment potentially in those portfolios. If the economics of it doesn't work out, that's going to inhibit these utilities to make money into the future. There's significant state support or very tight market regulation. So that presents a risk to delivering on ADB's energy policy in some respects, to enable actors in these countries to deliver infrastructure. So what are the main implications of what I'm saying? ADB has done incredible work over the last number of years and is likely to continue to do that, of course, with committing to align its operation with the Paris Agreement, its investment in renewable energy. To reflect this, ADB is updating its policy to provide guidance and screening criteria on the use of fossil fuels to ensure no conflict with broader international goals to which ADB is and its member countries ascribe to. Coal and gas plants, as I've said, while they're a priority for delivering energy access, in the long run, the economics just don't largely make sense. And they really make, they're unlikely to make it's uncertain if they make the financial return required to pay for themselves, even in the next 10 years. And ADB's policy aims to avoid investing in potential stranded assets. So this analysis would show that while future investment in these regions would be misaligned and could potentially be a stranded asset already. And this has got implications for international trade and supply chains, as I mentioned earlier. For factories relying on power, they may need clean electricity to facilitate with what we're seeing is the rise of carbon border taxes abroad, and this creates huge problems in its own right, and firms looking into emissions accounting in their own operations as well, and how they can reduce their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And so we need to manage the wind down of fossil fuel infrastructure. That could be a pillar of ADB's policy to mitigate the impacts of stranded assets on these countries, and to secure their economic viability and growth in the future in the most just and equitable way possible, which is, of course, what they're doing. And that the first step, I think, to do that is to commit to a coal phase-out strategy, which could be useful to indicate to stakeholders that we see this as a significant risk, which I'm sure the bank already does, but you should too, because the region is heavily invested in coal and the bank's leadership could heavily influence that. That's my brief presentation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Connell, for your presentation. I could not see the slide, but I have colleagues taking note and will get your slide. I will reserve also a further round of questions to you specifically, since we are talking about this stranded assets. Would you be considering the level of carbon price in determining eventually in your assessment or sensitivity assessment whether one investment or one asset would become a stranded asset, or you have other factors to be considered, like competitive technologies? What are the specific factors would help us to determine what asset may become stranded? So that's a question. I'll come back to you. So before that, I would like to ask Ms. Randi Christiansen, economics and financial analyst from IEA International. IEA, yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for allowing me to be here today. I will make my intervention quite short so we also can get to the discussion, but I think it's quite clear that in order to reach sustainability targets, investments must go up. And obviously ADB is a key enabler of this in Southeast Asia. I think one of the things that's been touched upon here in the other presentations is the age of thermal power plants and in general the context of Southeast Asia. And to me, one of the key barriers, but also opportunities for Southeast Asia to transition to cleaner energy sources is actually the context. So to me, you can't really have a power sector without taking into account the existing assets. And a holistic approach to energy transition is really important. Holistic approaches also includes grids. Grids are a key enabler of flexibility in order to integrate renewable energy. Asia does have a large, diverse set of resources of renewable energy, and connecting areas, both within nations, but also between nations with grids is key. Understanding also how to mobilize finance with grids is really important, because currently grids are mostly financed by the nations themselves, but obviously with the pandemic, priorities have, competing priorities for the investments have increased. So one important point regarding grids as well is if you increase grids but don't increase renewable energy, you'll actually see an increase in emissions. So when you invest in grids, they need to be coupled with very clear deployment targets as well. And I think that is a very important point, that sometimes you see that grids don't qualify for green finance because of you can't guarantee what type of power they transport. But if you couple them with actually some target lending, where you have targets for deployment of renewables, you'll still see a positive green effect of investing in grids. I think that is very important. Another key consideration has been touched upon by various other speakers is utilization of existing assets. So existing assets may need retrofits. We see that across Southeast Asia, the minimum stable run rate of coal, for example, is quite high compared to international systems where you use these assets for flexibility. Another key point for that is actually also considering the commercial flexibility. That is actually a barrier for flexibility in many systems, both across Asia, but also other systems. So we see in Southeast Asia that there's a current lock-in effect because there's a lot of minimum take obligations in PPAs, physical PPAs currently, that actually don't allow for renewables to necessarily come in properly in the merit order, because if you have take or pay obligations both on fuel supply contracts, but also on your generation assets, then effectively the fuel becomes sunk cost and it has the same marginal cost as renewables. And if you're used to operating a system with a lot of thermals, then it might just be easier to curtail the renewables than run the existing assets. So in that sense, there needs to be a clear analysis of the extent of the problem of physical PPAs and how potentially to restructure them or create different mechanisms for incentivizing flexible operations of the thermal assets. So in short, obviously there's a lot of different technologies within the renewables that can support Southeast Asia, but the holistic approach with looking at contractual flexibility, technical flexibility, and especially grids, I think is a key enabler to set Southeast Asia on a path for success for clean energy transitions. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you, Ms. Randi, for your remarks. I learned good messages from you, and you mentioned grid, and this is one of concerns for ADB. Half of our lending is in grid. But I will have a question to you later on. Hopefully, we still have time for a second round. Do you believe that the cross-regional interconnection between nations would also help the growing penetration of renewable energy, knowing that the energy system, many people are saying that the renewable energy would go for, the whole energy system will go for decentralized, distributed. So do you still believe the large-scale inter-nations connections? India is talking about global, and China also, they're talking about global interconnections. So what would your views from that perspective? So with that, I think we have went through a first round of interesting presentations. I would like now to go back to our first speaker, Dr. Uttama, who was, I hope he's been prepared for my question. Take one country, for example, how this particular country can move away from fossil fuels. What are the challenges? You know, since the whole ASEAN countries, most of them are very much coal dependent. Please, Dr. Uttama, please.
Yes, thank you, Yongbing Zai. It is in the reality speaking, as you may know, that Indonesia has established a 10 gigawatt power plant in 2009, and then continue with their plan on the 35 gigawatt of power plant in the next decades after 2009 until today, and still going on. And most of those are coming from the coal power plant. So the meaning of this is that most of the coal power plant being built in the country is quite relatively new. That's why it is a very big challenge for the country to really suddenly switch from this coal into totally without coal power plant, or dismantling all of those to be the new fuel. It is very challenging indeed. But the good thing is that the country already considering on the next 35 gigawatt plant for using the HELE technology. As I mentioned previously, the high efficiency and low emission kind of technology on their new development. And they also already considering on stopping the all subcritical type of power plant, and try to increase the share of natural gas power plant, and also increasing the share of RE as well, on especially the VRE on the grid. Another challenge on that matters is in the system itself. The country need to upgrade and advancing the grid, and also installing the smart grid as well. And the thing is that the main grid in the country, Jawa, Madura, and Bali, currently is oversupply, especially after the COVID-19 happens. This will also creating another issues when we haven't connect the Jawa, Madura, Bali to Sumatra, and that's still becoming an issue. And in regard with this potential in Southeast Asia, whenever we already connected between Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and the peninsula, as well as the northern part of the region, this issue can be easily solved, because the demand is widely available into the other countries in the region. So if we talk about when, it is, we discussed the other day with area as well, and with the member states. It will not happen very soon. Even in the next 20 or 40 years, it may not be happening drastically. But bit by bit, we try to reduce our dependency because of these two main issues, affordability and security. Whatever it is, the region, especially in Indonesia, we need to import later on in the next 20 years, both coal and natural gas. It is also another reality. So whatever it is, we need to think on the transition seriously to mitigate the problem of the security issues as well as affordability issues in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Utama, for sharing your assessment of one example in Indonesia, and we see clearer that the challenges here. Still in Indonesia, not Indonesia, but Ambu, I think you are based in Jakarta still. What's your advice on new reforms that would push low carbon transition by market forces?
Sure, and here to answer, that is what could be the new innovations, but we also need to look into back, that is how our first generation of reforms has worked out, and sometimes it has failed. And if you come into the renewable energy, that is also related to the low carbon. And here we find many countries are basically implemented the reforms to improve basically it is a kind of technology push approach, like feed-in tariff and feed-in premium, and also subsidizing this renewable energy. And this basically partly worked out. But at the same time, we also see some kind of conflict at the macro level, and between one is that is subsidizing these fossil fuels and as well as the promoting the renewable energy. Basically, we find that conflict within the technology push approach also. Then what could be the future? And here the future emerging economies, like I think within the region, and only one country that has been introduced this carbon tax. I think that is also at a very low level, and still this carbon tax and the ETS, this emission trading systems at the sector level or at the country level or the city level, these are the kind of new opportunities available for to be tested and experimented. And as it is happening in China and Japan and Korea, and this has to be watched out. But these things, market mechanisms doesn't work perfectly, and we need a kind of enabling conditions where we need to look into that is how these subsidy regimes exist. For example, taking the case of Sumatra and Western Malaysia, it could be grid connected, but why this is not happening? Why market is not working? Because of existing the different subsidy regimes. So this is a kind of prerequisite for introducing these market reforms. And basically there are two more areas, there is a policy areas where the countries or the ADB new policy could look into it. Another is how this trade regimes and energy regimes and the climate regimes can come together. Now they are operating in a different silo patients. And for example, ASEAN Economic Community exists, but still this is the tariff barriers remain high in the renewable energy and the energy efficiency technologies. So that is one area that is ADB can look into it in the future. And second thing is how to converge this fiscal policy regimes and the energy policy regimes. For example, when we introduce the carbon pricing mechanisms, how this revenue recycling can happen. How this extra revenue that is developed through the pricing mechanism can be invested on the renewable energy or the energy efficiency improvement. And here we don't have a kind of clear case studies or the existing models, but it has to be experimented and innovated. And but we do have some of these working models exist in the other part of the regions where we can look into it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ambu. I have a follow-up question, but prepare yourself if we still have time. And you talk about carbon pricing, and this is true. I think it's an effective way of renting our investment, favoring low carbon solutions. But how do you see affordability issue? As Dr. Utama has earlier mentioned, that the concerns for many developing countries, one is affordability, the other one is supply security. Making carbon price that's effective, but whether that would make the price of energy services more expensive, how do we deal with that? I consider that also part of so-called just transition. Often people talk about just transition for different workers in the sector that may lose their job. But I think just transition may also require making sure that whatever we provide to people, to poor people, you mentioned that it should be human-based, the solutions. So the affordability is an issue I want to also hear from you as an economist. Next, I would like to go to Dr. Philip for my earlier question, if I can find still my reference, but you would remember my question.
Yes, I can remember the question. The issue is gas as a transition fuel in Southeast Asia. I've been quickly looking through IEA and ASEAN Center for Energy projections, and yes, gas is there. It takes decades before it replaces coal, but because one of the challenges in Southeast Asia is energy demand, and particularly electrification and electricity demand is going to keep rising for a long time. Not just for industry, but for space cooling. Fortunately, you don't need space heating down here, which is obviously the problem in northern China and places. So you're going to need continued investment in new electricity capacity. So why not have gas? It's got less carbon dioxide emissions and other pollutants than coal. It's more flexible. It therefore supports renewable energy. But I think in most of Southeast Asia, it will come at a higher cost than coal. And coming back to Dr. Jai's comment of, yes, the users will have to pay more. Also, I think a lot of the incremental gas is likely to be imported as LNG, unless I used to be an exploration geologist a long time ago, but unless there are massive new discoveries made in the Southeast Asia region, it will be imported LNG. And yes, that's a market price. Sometimes it's very low, sometimes it's very high. So, you know, ASEAN is exposed to increasing imports of oil already. By moving to gas, it will become import dependent on natural gas, which can be dealt with, but it's a risk. So yes, it's there. It's not the magic bullet, but along with renewables and energy efficiency, hydrogen, importing electricity by wire from Australia or whatever, gas is part of the mix. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Philip. Since I see you're based in Singapore, I would reserve a third question if we still have time. Now, how do you see Singapore? Singapore is using a lot of gas, but Singapore also declared very ambitious target for climate action. So how do you see how Singapore will move away from fossil fuels and get a lot of gas in there? So. Reserve that for next round. I hope we still have time. Next, Dr. Conor Hickey, I think I was asking about carbon price, how that would affect our assessment on this existing asset or future asset. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree to your earlier points too that the carbon prices should be integrated in a way that's really fair and just. And obviously, I'd support the maybe commitment of governments in the region to have a gradual increase from a low base in carbon price over time to give corporations the opportunity to shift their decision making towards investments away from coal into renewables, even though it is quite urgent, the implications for costs to consumers. And if there isn't sufficient alternatives like clean energy, it can just lead to issues of rising fuel prices rather than that shift. And also, those carbon prices are likely to siphon away cash flows that could be used to transform a business. So I think strong incentives to transform and that recognize potentially the weaker balance sheets of those utilities are also really, really important. But I think the state, the actors like ADB and utilities working cohesively together to resolve these problems is really effective in an area where increasing energy prices are a huge concern. But I think to these plants and utilities, the bigger risk is international trends and the pace at which countries are moving and how that positions Southeast Asia's competitiveness as a fantastic place for manufacturing and other services to the global economy, and how that plays into global supply chains and the emissions accounting of corporations globally.
Thank you, Dr. Conor. I also have a follow-up question. Actually, given your position, your title there, I see stranded asset we talk about. Then you have in your title transition finance. I would like you to define what is transition finance in the next question, and whether this include the rehabilitation of some coal-based coal-fired power plant, or it's about natural gas. What is about compared to what we understand better climate financing? What is transition finance? What's actually included in there? But the next round. Next, I think I asked Ms. Randy about interconnections.
Yes, thank you very much. The idea of very global interconnections is a great idea. I think, though, we need to respect when you're talking cross-border interconnection, that you're talking about interconnecting or tying together infrastructure, critical national infrastructure. And as such, it's not as easy as it may look. So before doing a large-scale global electricity network, I would say let's start a little bit smaller. And I think, for example, ACE is doing very important work in their AIMS-3 study, showing how Southeast Asia can interconnect. And you're also seeing some good initiatives coming out of Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. I will, though, say when you're talking about cross-border interconnection, I think it's really important not to repeat the same mistakes of the coal assets, that you make very, very fixed long-term PPAs on your grids. Because grids has been shown to be a very effective tool to increase your balancing area, smooth out a lot of the variations that you see from renewable energy, but you certainly cannot do that if you lock yourself into physical PPAs on the interconnection as well. So having market setups that allow flexible utilization of the grids is important. For example, you're seeing in Laos that they have a lot of hydropower. And if you compare it to, for example, Northern Europe, they can take on the role of for example, Norway, that they're doing for Scandinavia. Norway is allowing Scandinavia and Denmark, where I come from personally, to integrate high shares of wind. But that's only possible because Denmark can export power to Norway when the wind is high, and they can import hydro back when the wind is low. So in that sense, I think, especially with the diversity you see across Southeast Asia, that grids are an excellent opportunity. But again, I must stress, physical PPAs, fixed physical PPAs will hinder that. And secondly, if grids are built out, again, without deployment of renewables, you'll just see an increase in emissions, because you'll see that coal currently is the cheapest source of generation in Southeast Asia and will be favored compared to, for example, gas. So I think, again, the holistic approach to how you build out the grids is really important.
Thank you, Ms. Randy. I also reserve a third question to you. You mentioned the experience in Northern Europe and in Europe in general. The grids are better interconnected, for sure. But these grids happen because there is a consensus, commitment among countries. In our region, that pushing for regional interconnection is not just a question of economics. It's not the technologies, not only about renewable energy, also about political wills and commitment. Mm-hmm. There are more, I would say, some perception of energy security and, from the other point of view, then, there are countries, trust has to be built. What are the good lessons we can learn from Europe, make a successful, interconnections, everything is good. Economics work, technology are there, but countries just don't like to get perhaps overly dependent on each other. And this happened in former Soviet Union states, that they were used to interconnected, then somehow they are now much more independent, and the grid is operating much smaller scale in terms of trade among them. So that's a question, perhaps a difficult question, but I really want to hear from Europe how that can be best dealt with. Now back to, I forgot to ask a question to Dr. Uttama, but I will think about one. But let's go back to Dr. Ambu first. You remember my question?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Jai. And it is a very complex question, and how we can make carbon pricing affordable. And basically, the question is also related to willingness to pay. And if you see that is many, and we are very fancy about carbon pricing, but in the hard reality is nobody is willing to pay. And why? And this carbon tax and the carbon pricing is going to be a painful process. And there will be losers and there will be winners. And the basic question is how we are going to compensate for the losers. I think that is a kind of a narrative that is we need to think about it. at the national level, how we can move forward. And my formula here is just focus on the subsidies, and then move gradually to introduce these emission trading systems, and then finally go for the carbon tax or the carbon pricing. I think that kind of stepwise approach could be kind of pragmatic and given these hard realities that we are facing. And the second thing is this carbon pricing could also be need to be seen from a kind of regional effort. If you're coming to the Southeast Asia, most of them are the export-oriented economies, where the energy pricing or the carbon pricing is directly linked to the competitiveness of their industries. And here we need to think about it. And even in the COP 21 in the Paris, basically they were proposed for the global carbon price, but it failed. And that may be the fate at the regional level also. Here we need to think that is how we can coordinate and harmonize this emerging market. And there are 3 countries in the region has already decided to introduce this emission trading system. One country has already introduced the carbon pricing. And here we need to discuss and decide and what could be the appropriate level that may be at the very low level. A second thing is to look into this other past experiences, for example, China and Japan and Korea and India, and how these things could be combined together and kind of club making, and these countries can come together and learn from each other and then start with this low-hanging fruit, which is that energy efficiency improvement. Then stepwise we can move towards this decarbonization of the electric system and finally that fuel switching. I think this is a kind of my thoughts for having a stepwise and gradual regionally coordinated way of introducing the carbon pricing.
Thank you, Dr. Ambu. I thought about a question to Dr. Uttama on another question. Actually, I assume there's still a great deal of subsidies to gasoline and some other petroleum product. What's the current situation in Indonesia or in ASEAN? And what are the moves that, instead of increasing the carbon price that's good for renewable energy, but you can also remove any subsidies for fossil fuels. That's another way to make things happen. So that's a question to Dr. Uttama, but also Dr. Ambu, you can help as well. I think you are also specialists in this. Okay, next my question to Dr. Philip was on Singapore's ambitious plan for carbon neutrality, whether there is a chance, how physically, technology-wise, how Singapore is going to achieve that objective, and as an example for other island nations.
Well, I'm not sure they've actually pledged that they will. It's sort of, we'll consider how to do it and when. I mean, the problem with Singapore is not just an island, but for anybody who's been here, it's an island covered in concrete and people. It's one of the most densely populated, small countries in the world. So you've got a real space problem. And so, yes, there's a solar PV roadmap published by the Singapore Renewable Energy Research Institute. Solar Energy Research Institute of Singapore. And yes, there's a significant percentage that can be solar, especially if they can get solar on the reservoirs, solar on every building, solar on the facades of buildings. You can go some distance, but you'll obviously need storage. But the problem is you can't have onshore wind, there's not enough space, and all the offshore is covered with ships and ports and whatever and sea lanes. So you cannot develop offshore wind, you can't develop marine energy except for solar energy in very small places. So there's a real problem there. What are the options that are being looked at? Clearly energy efficiency, hydrogen is another, importing renewable energy. So that's why back last October, the government announced, okay, we're going to start importing tiny amount of energy from Malaysia, but that's a start to bring more energy, either hydro from Laos or new solar from Malaysia. And as I mentioned earlier, there's this idea of a line from Australia to bring renewable energy in. But no, they haven't worked out, and we're involved in helping them working out, I suppose, how to put all these things together. District cooling systems that are efficient, all of that sort of stuff. It's going to be a real challenge to put it all together, and control systems to make it work. Not in my lifetime, maybe in Connor's lifetime. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Philippe. I also learned not to read about the Australian project. That's the huge, ambitious project. Let's see what will happen. My next question to Dr. Connor about the definition of transition finance.
Yes, great. So back to your point about the title. So stranded assets is a recognition of the problem, and transition finance is about, for some companies, they've got up to 20 years to deal with this, and that's true in Southeast Asia as well. And in a recent study we currently did for European utilities, we found that over the next 20 years they could completely decarbonize their portfolios with minimal impacts on their credit ratings. So to formally define what transition finance is, and the big reveal, the director of our institute has published a definition of it, which I'm going to use here. I've been called to cut. Transition finance is the provision and use of financial products and services to support counterparties such as companies, sovereigns, and individuals realize alignment with environmental and social sustainability. So what we're seeing internationally is the deployment of sustainability linked debt products, loans, and different use of proceeds products. And all of these can be used to incentivize companies through lower costs of capital, for example, and if they meet certain sustainability alignments like emissions reductions. How can that be used to help these counterparties, such as coal utilities, and incentivize them to reduce to zero emissions or net zero emissions, depending on the sector they're in?
Okay. Maybe another question quickly. This one, sure. How long you have been, this, whether you call it division or unit, stranded assets and transition finance? Is it new, or it's been there for some time?
It's been here since 2011, and it was largely the centre's sole focus. But in the last 2 to 3 years, it's been something that I've been delegated to deal with as well. And if anybody wants to learn about it, please get in touch or to get access to the slides I presented today. Happy to share any information.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A question to Ms. Randy about advice on how to build consensus on the interconnections.
Yeah, thank you very much. So IEA is actually doing quite a lot of work on multilateral power trade in Southeast Asia. We, in 2019, published a study called Establishing Multilateral Power Trade in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN. And I think before I used Europe as an example of resource sharing, but I really want to stress that the European model might never be relevant for Southeast Asia. So in the study that we did, we bring a lot of different case studies around the world. And for example, when you look at Southern African power pool, they have a different approach to cross-border power trading, where they're trading gaps and excesses. And I think when you're talking about cross-border power trade, the really important point is to start building trust. So this can be done with less integrated model, like the type of model that you have in Southern Africa. Because obviously there is a political trade-off between being independent and economics and meeting your climate goals by actually integrating. And it's going to be a political decision. And I don't believe that the same political decision may be valid across the world. So Europe, for example, has the massive benefit that they have a supranational organized institution, the EU, that can actually enforce rules within the member countries. You don't have that in Southeast Asia, and you don't have that, for example, in Southern Asia, where you're looking to integrate, or Central Asia for that matter. And that type of sovereignty surrender you might never want, and that is perfectly okay. So that is to say that there are different models where you don't optimize across countries in the same way, that will still bring massive benefits in terms of resource sharing and integration of renewables. So I encourage anyone to get in touch or look at the study that we published, and happy to take up discussion on this.
Thank you, Ms. Randy, for your advice. Good study from IEA. We'll come to close 5 minutes more, but I still have one question to Dr. Uttama on fossil fuel subsidies. And after that, I want to each of panelists to answer me one question from me related to policy, energy policy for ADB. I remember this session is about ADB energy policy. The question is short, but I want to get your advice on that. Your answer can be brief as well. So the question is, would you recommend ADB to withdraw financing entirely for coal, including new coal, building new coal, and rehabilitation of existing coal? This would be a question I want to hear from panelists, from whether from your professional background or your country background, your understanding of the issue, whether this is recommendable to ADB, withdrawing entirely from coal finance. Now, first from Dr. Uttama from on fossil fuel subsidies.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Yongping. Fossil fuel subsidy is quite sensitive issues in the region, very political in that sense. Currently, in fact, some of the countries already lifting up the subsidies. But in regards with this issue of transition, I think that will be, in my opinion, personally, uncorrelated directly between the lifting of the subsidy and the increase of VRE or RE in the region. Whatever it is, in the end, the region require a quite strong requirements, which is the affordable system, the energy security, affordability as well as sustainability. So regardless the issues of the subsidies in the sectors. I think that's my response on your particular.
Thank you. Any additional point from Ambu?
Yeah, and on this subsidies, I think almost all countries have the subsidies, and what is the extent of the subsidies and what is the implications on the tax structure. For example, in Indonesia and here the tax base is very limited, but the subsidies maybe at one point of time that is 13%. But this pandemic and these low oil prices provide an opportunity for innovate. And for example, the conditional cash transfer programs that is targeted for the low-income households and for the small and medium enterprises. I think it is a kind of win-win strategy, and we need to be more innovations how we can protect these losers. I think some countries like Indonesia and also as well as India is very successful in introducing the subsidy reforms.
Okay, thank you very much. With the remaining 2 minutes, I will come back to my earlier question. I can reformulate that question in a different way. Whether the question could be whether there are exceptional cases that ADB could still finance coal. Back to our panelists. I hope it's not too difficult. Let's start with Ms. Randy on reverse order.
Yes, thank you very much. I think when you look at least the IEA World Energy Outlook scenarios, it's quite clear that the only coal that will come into the system in Southeast Asia is coal that is already planned. So I don't think withdrawing finance maybe from things that are already signed and sealed, just not delivered, is the best, because you also need to make sure that you have proper investment environments going forward. But I do think that new deals might not be the best, because as Connor would point to, stranded assets is a real risk, and you don't want to create more of those. I actually do think that retrofitting and programs for retrofitting, if they are retrofitted in a way that they allow for higher flexibility and the PPAs are restructured so they actually commercially can run flexibly, might make sense. Because again, I think it's a little bit utopian to think that you can just get rid of all the coal assets overnight in Southeast Asia. So you need to think of a way to actually utilize them as a bridge to where you want to get to.
Good. So let's hear from Dr. Connor then.
I largely agree. I think financing new coal assets probably wouldn't be a good idea, just because of the economic case. But for existing infrastructure, the case for retrofitting is really good because it can maintain employment in the region, provide better jobs, and it's a more equitable way of dealing with it. For new investments, they're probably going to need to be converted at some point in the future. So it makes sense just to do that now and get it out of the way rather than running into the additional costs in the future and the wasted capital, organizational and financial issues that arise from committing to it. So yes to new and to refinancing old coal plants, and that there has to be exceptions because the economic impacts would be devastating for some regions, obviously.
Thank you, Dr. Connor. Now, Dr. Philip, please.
Well, I just really to add, yes, I mean, the money that you might have put into coal, put into gas and carbon capture. But again, the caveat is there that if you guys and others don't finance coal, the Chinese might. And we haven't yet seen the Chinese banks really make a clear statement that they're edging towards it, that they would remove themselves from coal. But that's the key to watch in Southeast Asia, I think.
Thank you. Dr. Anbu, please.
Yeah, it is, I think, complex question. And the one thing is what heart speaks, and another is the hard realities. And my first question back goes to that is whether ADB has the resources to finance the coal. And here, basically, the private financing can help it. And basically continue this older policy and focus more on the renewables. And if you are interested in and basically putting on the carbon capturing or the new type of energy like a hydrogen fuel, maybe an area that is ADB can look into it. And basically the private sector financing can help under this new clean coal power plants. That is my stance.
And thank you, Dr. Anbu. And lastly, last word from Dr. Nuki Agya Uttama, Executive Director, ASEAN Center for Energy. You have the last word for the session.
Yes, thank you. I do agree to the most speakers on the not 100% lifting the potential of the financial support to the region towards the coal. As we're realizing that in our projection, as well as the most of the member countries agreed on the increasing share of the fossil fuel, particularly on relying on the coal, is quite heavy in the next 20 years. I think that will be very difficult condition if in the region having zero financial support coming from all of these development banks. And we're really looking for some development bank which is providing this financial support, as mentioned by Dr. Philip, maybe perhaps China, because of this terminology of sustainability in every countries, every region are different. And that's why also very tricky really on not having a support for these particular issues. I think focusing on Hele is one of the things that we need to really looking forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Uttama. With that, we close the session. I just want to thank all our panelists for spending 1.5 hours for discussing, helping ADB to reshape our energy policy. And also I thank a participant in the audience for being with us. Thank you so much.